We're honored to announce that J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, is confirmed for a live tour stop in Hershey, Pennsylvania next month. Tickets are on sale at tuckercarlson.com. We hope to see you there. We'll be in cities all across the country starting next week. But first, our interview with Bobby Kennedy Jr., his first since endorsing Donald Trump on Friday. Here it is. So people were shocked. I know a lot of people you know well were shocked when you endorsed Trump. I was not shocked because for all the areas where you disagree on specific issues, there's a consistent theme that I've noticed in both of your lives, which is you've both spent the majority of your life, well, in your case, your whole life, in the American ruling class, and both of you decided that it was corrupt and that you were going to say so out loud at great risk to both of you. And so it was probably just a matter of time before you aligned in some way. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a bunch of realignments, political realignments, about 4 or 5 throughout American history. And I think we're going through one right now with the Democratic Party and with both political parties really changing in this very dramatic way. And you and I talked earlier about the transformation of the Republican Party into the party of environmentalism.
Yes.
And, where the Democratic Party has one environmental issue, which is this carbon orthodoxy, which ends up benefiting, the oil companies and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs with offshore wind and carbon capture, $100 billion carbon capture projects, which is part of just the strip mining of the middle class. And it's the only issue you can talk about in the Democratic Party. I got into the environmental movement to do habitat protection, to do wildlife conservation,
exactly.
to get toxics out of our kids.
Amen.
And none of these are issues that the party itself, Democrats care about them, but the party itself doesn't. But there's been these big, profound realignments, and it's not only on that issue. It's really the domination of this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is happening in Washington, D.C. now, where our democracy has really been subverted by the industries that have taken over the regulatory agencies, and they transformed them into sock puppets for corporate profit taking. And basically wholly owned subsidiaries of the industries they're supposed to regulate. And the Democrats, for a variety of reasons, and I watched it happen over many, many years, have clung to this illusion of these democratic institutions that they're still democratic, and they have a belief we all have the capacity to judge ourselves on our intentions rather than our actions,
yes.
Right? And,
I've been there.
And the Democratic Party judges itself, it sees itself, my friends who are Democrats, see themselves as part of the good guys, the white hats, and that, they're like the good guys who are in Fort Apache, surrounded by the forces of barbarism that are about to storm the gate, and they're the only ones. The only way to keep it at bay is to elect a president who has dementia, and because you're voting for the apparatus,
yes,
and you're not voting for or another president. Then to handpick a presidential candidate without any elections, to basically get rid of democracy in order to save it, and handpick a candidate who in 40 days now has not given a single interview on any media outlet. And I think about when my uncle and father would think about that. They prided themselves on being able to go on debate. It was the centerpiece. The whole function of democracy was to anneal ideas in the furnace of debate and have them rise up in the marketplace of ideas. And the idea that, and we had this British tradition of Churchill and the others and the House of Commons, and being able to defend their policies and being forced to defend their policies articulately, eloquently. And, my uncle and father just thought ideas are important and we should be able to defend them. And if you can't defend them, there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
And, why? So we have a presidential candidate that was selected by the Democratic Party who can't do that. And, one of the things that my uncle and father will always think about is how do we look to the rest of the world, right? They were conscious that America was the template for democracy. When we created a modern democracy in 1789 or 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, we were the only democracy on earth. By 1865, during the end of the Civil War, there were 5, and they were all modeled on America. And by the time my uncle took office, there was about 150, and by the end of the 60s, there's 190. They're all based on American model. And, we very much were the exemplary nation. We were the example of democracy around the globe, and they were very conscious. They were embarrassed at first by the civil rights movement because they said, what is the rest of the world going to think about it? And then they realized, well, we better correct, the problem.
Yeah.
Because, but everything that they did, they were conscious that they were being watched. Well, what does the rest of the world think of American democracy right now? That, that we have in one party selected a man with dementia to lead the free world, and then turned around and picked a woman who cannot give an interview. She cannot defend her vision or America's record in the world. And then she gave this, Vice President Harris gave this speech at the convention that was written by neocons. And they had CIA directors talking at the Democratic Convention, military people talking at the Democratic Convention. My father and my uncle were the party of anti-war. My uncle was asked by his best friend, Ben Bradley, one of his 2 best friends who ran the Washington Post, what do you want on your gravestone, your epitaph? And my uncle said immediately he kept the peace. He said the primary job of a president of the United States was to keep the country out of war. He said he didn't want children in Africa and Latin America and Asia, when they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. They wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer and the Alliance for Progress and USAID, which were programs that he created to build the middle class, to end run the oligarchs, end run the military juntas that used to receive U.S. aid, and instead go directly to the poor and build institutions, education and health and all of the institutions of democracy to continue to model it for the rest of the world and live up to what we were supposed to be doing, which is to encourage the growth of democratic rule. So now we have a system that's produced people who, a candidate in the Democratic Party who can't even defend America's record in the world, and who is parroting this kind of warmongering, military domination ideology that's gotten us in such trouble. It's caused a calamity in our country. It's gutted the middle class. It's made us a pariah around the globe. It led to the rise of BRICS. It's leading to the rise of totalitarianism all over the world. And, I'd say this finally, that if you really look at what's happening in the Democratic Party today, it's a party that the word demos in Greek means people. But it's a party that's lost faith in the people. It's a party that needs ironclad control. So they didn't trust anybody to have a real election. They got rid of the primaries because they didn't trust the people. They then handpicked Vice President Harris with no election, no even pretense of election, because they didn't trust the people. And, you have, and they're the party now of censorship. And
how can you have a democracy with censorship?
You cannot have a democracy. They're absolutely incompatible. And everybody knew that. Everybody, you and I were raised reading Orwell and Aldous Huxley and Robert Heinlein and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and all of these other books that were part of classical literature that was taught in every American classroom. It said the first step to totalitarianism is always, begins with censorship. It's the first step down that slippery slope. And there's no time that we look back in history and say the people who were censoring speech were the good guys. They're always the bad guys, because we know that they're the guys who are going to end up cracking the whip on us all and being our overlords. And then the whole thing about, like, you and I have talked about that clip of Tim Walz, Governor Walz, saying that government should be the ultimate arbiter of what is protected speech and what is not. He said if something that the First Amendment does not protect, misinformation and disinformation, but it does. The First Amendment was written to protect not only true speech but false speech, and speech that it wasn't there and it's unnecessary to protect the kind of speech that everybody wants to hear. It's there to protect the kind of speech that nobody wants to hear.
Right. And especially speech that is critical of the people in charge.
Exactly.
And so in their current formulation, misinformation is defined as any speech that criticizes the job that they're doing. So with that in mind, you see the Biden administration encouraging France, Macron, to arrest the owner and founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, who's now, as of right now, in a French prison. That seems like, that's the hallmark of dictatorship, it sounds to me.
Yeah, well, we've lost Europe. Europe does not have free speech. Look what's happened to Elon Musk. And Elon Musk should be the hero of the Democratic Party. Of the old Democratic Party, he wouldn't be the hero. Somehow he became a villain because he was actually the only platform that would allow free speech on his platform. And he's now become a villain because of it, because the Democratic Party does not believe in the people. If you don't believe in free speech, it means because you don't trust the people. You don't trust them to figure it out on their own, to have information on which they can base their ideas and their notions and their beliefs.
And their votes.
And that the government has to protect them from dangerous information, from things that might put bad ideas into their heads. And it's very patronizing, but it's also very manipulative and conniving, and really it's exactly the opposite of democracy. And you will not find a single Democrat who will criticize it. It's really astonishing to me, because the Democrats always like to, when I endorsed Trump, the fulcrum of the centerpiece of the text of hatred that I got back, this kind of seething anger from so many Democrats, was, well, look what he did on January 6th. Okay, January 6th was a bad day in American history. And what President Trump did there, in my view, was very bad. It was reprehensible. But was the Republic really at risk? We have the U.S. military, we have the National Guard, they have all the institutions, we have Congress, we have all these institutions of government, and there was a mob of people, most of them who probably didn't know what was happening. Some of them were very badly intentioned and were breaking the law. But it wasn't a threat to the Republic. What is a threat, and this is what you cannot explain to a Democrat now, and it's astonishing to me. What is a threat is when the government is censoring your speech. political speech. And, I just won Tucker last week.
But that was the centerpiece of Democratic ideology, was free speech.
Exactly. I mean, the word liberal means free speech. That's where it comes from. Oh,
That must be weird for you, being named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and spending your entire life in this world. Like, what's that like?
Let me just say this. I won a lawsuit. I won a new judgment in my lawsuit, Kennedy versus Biden, last week. And Kennedy versus Biden was part of two lawsuits that were brought, one by the attorney generals of Missouri and Louisiana, and the other by me, for the same issues, which was the Biden administration's censorship of speech. And so there's a series of decisions. There's a 155-page decision. The attorney general's case went up to the Supreme Court and was rejected because the Supreme Court found that those attorney generals didn't have standing to sue because they weren't directly harmed. My case this week, the federal judge Doty said Kennedy does have standing to sue. And he reissued his injunction against the Biden administration. So I have an injunction right now against the Biden White House to enjoin them from censoring me, which they've been doing. The 155-page decision by Judge Doty details everything that happened. 37 hours after he took the oath of office, President Biden's White House opened up a portal for the FBI to begin to have access to social media posts on all the different social media sites. And the FBI then invited in the CIA, DHS, the IRS, and CISA. CISA is this new agency that is the center of the censorship industrial complex that is in charge of making sure Americans don't hear things that their government doesn't want them to hear. And those agencies and other agencies, including the health agencies like CDC, were given access to go into the social media sites and change posts and slow walk things and shadow ban posts. That it was part of that effort. They removed my Instagram account. I had almost 1 million followers. They say it was for misinformation, but they could not point to a single post that I ever made that was factually erroneous. And they actually, Facebook pushed back in the email chain. You can see Facebook pushing back at the White House and saying, well, wait a minute, he's not, this isn't misinformation. This is not factually erroneous. What they're saying is actually true. And they had to invent a new word, which is called malinformation, which is information that is factually true, but nevertheless inconvenient for the government. And that became disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. That's what that is. So everybody, and
isn't that that's illegal?
Yeah, and the emails show that Facebook, the people said they were saying about the White House in their private emails with each other. These people are cynical, terrible people, and they knew what they were doing was breaking the law, but they were under tremendous pressure. I mean, Facebook has all these deals with the government, and as do all the media companies with the intelligence agencies and elsewhere. Plus, the White House was overtly telling them that they were going to, if they didn't comply, that their Section 230 immunity was in jeopardy. So Section 230 immunity is just so that your listeners know what it is. I used to write for the New York Times regularly. Every time I wrote an article, lawyers would call me and fact check everything in that article. Because if I wrote something that was defamatory in that article, and somebody was defamed, that person could sue me, but they could also sue the New York Times. So the social media site said, we cannot hire lawyers to look at every post and call the people and check on it when, on Facebook or Instagram. So if this industry is going to function, we need to be able to not be liable for what is published on our site. And that is called Section 230 of the Communications Act. Congress said, if you are just a platform, a mere platform that for other people to publish, like Facebook is, like Instagram, like Twitter or X, that you're immune. Nobody can sue you. They can sue the person who wrote the post, but they can't sue Facebook. So Mark Zuckerberg said, if they take away our Facebook, our Section 230 immunity, it is existential, meaning we will no longer exist. And so they were terrified because Congress was actually considering removing Section 230 immunity. And the White House was telling them, if you don't censor our political critics, we're going to take away your Section 230 immunity. If President Trump did that, the Democrats would go berserk.
Well, that's criminal behavior. Anyone who does that is a criminal.
Right. They're violating the First Amendment of the Constitution, for starters.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. And, you know, my idea is that if somebody does something bad, it shouldn't matter whether they're Democrat or Republican.
I agree.
It is, you know, we should all be going after them, and we should be going after them as a society.
How much does it cost you to use the internet? Well, it's free, right? Google's free. Facebook is free. Instagram, totally free. That's what you've been convinced of, but it's a trick. None of it is free. In fact, you're paying with your data. Everything you do online can be seen and sold, not just to companies, but to governments, including foreign governments, and often is. So how do you reclaim your online privacy? It's important. Well, there is one way. It's called encryption. Strong encryption protects your right to privacy online and defends you from your many potential enemies online, including your own government. And it gives you back the freedom to read what you want, to write what you want, without prying eyes spying on you. So how do you get this freedom through encryption? I'll tell you how we do it. ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN reroutes 100% of our online activity through secure encrypted servers. Now, normally, if we didn't use it, internet providers would be able to read and see everything that we do online. In the United States, they could even sell it, as we said. But because we use ExpressVPN, they can't see any of it, 0% approximately. We also use it when we travel abroad because that same encryption shuts out hackers who might try and steal what we're doing, things like passwords or credit card details over sketchy Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi. That's not free either. It also shuts out foreign governments that might try and spy on us or censor what we're doing online. What we especially like about ExpressVPN is they're not a black box that promises privacy and tech solutions. We have to trust them. They've actually opened up their servers to professional auditors at PwC and KPMG, as well as independent security experts to evaluate the claims they're making about what they're doing, their privacy policy and their trusted server technology. So people are watching them. So it's a carefully designed server architecture that runs on volatile memory only. That means it never stores user data because it cannot store user data. It's impossible. It's private by design. They couldn't keep your stuff if they wanted to. So in a world where it seems like every corporation wants more and more of your private information to sell and manipulate, it's nice to find a company that actually goes the extra mile to protect it. That's their business, protecting your privacy. So if you want freedom online, and freedom means privacy, there's never been a better time to get it through ExpressVPN. You can use our special link to get 3 extra months of ExpressVPN for free at expressvpn.com/Tucker. That's Express, EXPRESS, VPN.com/Tucker.
What I don't understand, and it is baffling to me, having known a lot of Democrats, but you've been in that world your whole life, like, how do they not see that? How do people who say they believe in civil liberties suddenly think it's okay for the government to prosecute its political opponents and silence them? How do they think that?
You know, to me, I've thought a lot about that.
I bet.
And it's about tribalism. That people put themselves in these tribal categories, and we're hardwired for tribalism. That's why orthodoxies are so popular, that, people get sucked into various kind of orthodoxies, whether it's ideological orthodoxies or religious orthodoxies. And that impulse is really, it's not a religious impulse. It's a biological impulse. And it's an impulse that's hardwired in us from the 20,000 generations we spent wandering the African savannah in tiny little groups that were warring each other, where there was always a male leader, where the women were traded as chattels because you couldn't marry your sisters. So you knew from the beginning she was going to be a trade good, and you were going to trade her for somebody else. So she had no power. And where you all had to ascribe to an orthodoxy and see no problems with people who were within your in-group, and people who were outside were subhuman and they could be killed. And if they made a mistake, you wanted to talk about it. Everybody would talk about it. We're all hardwired that way because that's where our wiring comes from. And when somebody gets subsumed in orthodoxy, it's very, very difficult to unravel it. And there are all kinds of psychiatric treatises about how do you deprogram somebody? How do you talk somebody out of an orthodoxy? And the little that I know about it is that if you challenge them directly, you challenge their belief, it pours concrete on it, and it makes them less able to move off that, or they get very defensive. And that, the way to approach them, there are ways to approach them. There's deprogramming protocols, and they usually include a lot of Socratic method of asking them questions about their belief. But it's a one-on-one, project enterprise. And it's not something that you can do with the whole Democratic Party overnight. Something has to happen that's going to make this, this tribal thinking unravel, because it's really destroying our country. And the polarization, which is happening on both sides, is put on steroids by these social media algorithms that reward people for staying on the site as long as possible. So all the algorithm knows is I've got to keep as many eyeballs on the site as possible. It turns out that the way people stay on the site is if you fortify their existing opinions.
Of course.
If you feed them information that consolidates their worldview.
Yes.
And so, we have this problem now where it's not just polarization like the Civil War, but it's polarization on steroids, because you've got machines that are manipulating us to hate each other more every single day.
So knowing all this as you do and have for a long time, the most radical step you can make if you're a Democrat is endorsing Donald Trump. So there are political calculations involved, there are ideological calculations, but there are also, of course, personal calculations. So once you do that, you've burned your boats. Like, that's it. You're not going back to wherever you were 10 years ago. How hard a decision was that for you personally?
It was it was an obvious decision for me. It should have been, but it was a very, very difficult decision. And we had, I have a very, very good team around me. And I was most worried about my wife, who was, about Cheryl, who it was not comfortable with it. She's a lifelong Democrat. She's not the aristocracy. She comes from a very, I would say poor family in North Florida, but she found her way through idealism to the Democratic Party, and she shares a lot of those values. So and her industry is very, very much aligned with the Democratic Party, probably more than any industry in our country and more than any town in our country. So this, for me, was likely to have huge impacts on her. And ultimately, if she had told me, you can't do this, I wouldn't have done it. So, but I'm very grateful that she allowed me to do it. She was not embracing it, but she said, I understand why you have to do this. And we had a 4-day meeting up in Hyannisport in my home, where kind of everybody, my family members, my kids, many other people, Tony Robbins, attended remotely, and a number of other kind of spiritual leaders, just people who cared deeply about our country, chimed in and made cases on both sides. And people from the campaign organization did. But here was the calculus that ultimately was persuasive for me. All of our internal polling showed from the outset that if I stayed in the Democratic Party, I was going to get Vice President Harris elected. 57 to 60%, and even more, sometimes up to 66% of my voters, my followers said that if I withdrew from the election, they were going to vote for Trump, which is ironic, by the way, Tucker, because President Trump and the RNC did nothing to prevent me from being on the ballots. They didn't have a big major organization sending private eyes out. The Democratic Party was interviewing literally everybody I've ever met in 70 years to collect dirt on me. I got a call.
They've been doing that, I know for a fact, for over a year, as you know.
Yeah, and they were open about it. This is what we're going to do. They put a person in charge of it named Liz Smith, who's that's the kind of person she is. This is what she does. She does negative research on people and tries to character assess.
Liz Smith, Elliot Spitzer's old girlfriend?
Yes.
Oh.
And she was in charge of that team. And then there was other people as well. Mary Beth Cahill had been my uncle Teddy's chief of staff, who I knew. And Liz Smith was in charge of the negative research, what they call negative research, euphemistically. And I got calls from, for example, a guy that I met at an AA meeting 40 years ago, and he received a call. Most of my family members received calls, contacts, either text or telephone calls from people who said, I'm doing intelligence for the DNC, and, we'd like to talk to you about Robert Kennedy, and if you have any negative information about him. So I was getting that,
What could possibly be the justification for that?
Well, they didn't want me running, and that's the thing, is it's not democratic. It wasn't,
That's such a mafia tactic.
Yeah. So, but the point is, it was weird. It was not smart, because I was actually helping the Democrats, and if they just let me stay in and they didn't run this campaign against me, they probably would win this election. And because I was hurting Trump, oddly, Trump didn't do anything about it. He was kind of, he made a couple of statements about me that I was a communist, et cetera. But they were sort of good-natured, the stuff that you're like, okay, that's okay. They weren't like calling my old girlfriend saying, what did he do? Or, whatever they were asking him. So, but the DNC was up to that. And
were you shocked by that?
Was I shocked? I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm in a place now where nothing surprises me anymore.
I bet you are.
So, but I don't know. I mean, anyway. So
they're going to drop all that stuff now, obviously, right?
What? They're going to get rid of Liz Smith and put her on some other project? I don't know.
You sort of wonder, how does Liz Smith live with herself? I mean, that's so repulsive. Like, how does she justify that to herself? I've met her. She's not stupid. But that is disgusting. No, you've lived a life famously, and if you have a team of researchers digging into it.
And I have not led a careful life, by the way.
Well, I know.
I said, during my announcement speech, I said, I had told my wife told Cheryl this a couple of days before. I said, I have so many skeletons in my closet that if they could vote, I could run for king of the world. I know stuff's going to come out about me because let me put it, a colorful life.
Yeah.
And people have all kinds of stories about me, but so I'm ready for, I'm ready for. Listen. I never done anything criminal in terms of like stealing money or self-enrichment. I did a lot of stupid stuff and a lot of.
Have you gotten rich off pointless foreign wars?
No, I have not done that yet.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. You haven't forced people to inject substances in their bodies? Okay.
No, I've never done any of that. But anyway, so it became clear to me that if Kamala got elected, the issues that I cared about, which is ending the foreign wars, the unjust wars, the immoral wars, the wars of choice like Ukraine, stopping the censorship, which I think is existential for our democracy, and then protecting children from this extraordinary, exploding chronic disease epidemic. Those are the three reasons that got me into the campaign. That's why I ran for president. Those are three reasons. That if she got elected, I'm 70 years old, that 8 years from now, our kids are going to be lost. And if she's president for 8 years, my chance to do anything about it would be gone.
Yes.
And then I got a contact from Callie Means, who you know well,
yes.
who you've made one of the best shows ever put on TV, ever aired, was your interview with Callie and his wife. Casey and Callie, for those of you who haven't seen the show, his show is an expert, a genius, brilliant, articulate, eloquent, and incredible encyclopedic knowledge on the food system and what is corrupting it, what is causing the corruption at FDA, at USDA, that the capture of those agencies by the processed food industry, by the chemical industry, by the pharmaceutical industry, that actually profit on sick children. One of the things that Callie says, there is nothing more profitable in our society today than a sick child, because all of these entities are making money on them. The insurance companies, the hospitals, the medical cartel, the pharmaceutical companies have lifetime annuities. Any child and the earlier that kid is sick, they don't want to kill him. They want them sick for the rest of their lives. And we have now a whole generation. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today it's 60%. When my uncle was president, do you know what the cost, the annual cost of treating chronic disease was in this country? 0. There weren't even any drugs invented for it. 0. Today, it's about $4.3 trillion.
When your uncle was president...
And none of it is necessary.
What was the autism rate in 1960? Do we know?
In 1960, the autism rate, there's about 4 or 5 studies. And the highest rate, say about 1 in 2,500, 1 in 1,500, 1 in 2,500, 1 in 10,000. So that, it was somewhere between 1 in 1,500 and 1 in 10,000. Today, it's 1 in every 34 kids, according to CDC. And in some states, like California, I think maybe Utah and New Jersey, 1 in 22. 1 in 22 kids. And, these kids should be healthy. These kids should be our highest performing kids. And they instead are have this extraordinary disability that's going to keep them dependent and not... a lot of these, if you're full-blown autism, it's a nonverbal, non-toilet trained, head banging, stimming, toe walking. These are kids that will never throw a baseball. They'll never graduate high school. They'll never go out, take a girl on a date. They'll never use the toilet alone. They'll never write a play. They'll never write a poem. They'll never vote.
Never have children.
Never pay taxes.
Here's something you may not have known. Back in 2015, the Congress of the United States repealed something called the Country of Origin Labeling Act. Now, why is this relevant to you? Well, it means, among other things, that when you buy beef at the supermarket that says made in the USA, it may not actually be. In fact, it could be, likely is, from a foreign country. It means that repackaging foreign meat can be enough to get the Made in USA designation. It's a lie. It's an absolute lie. Most people don't even know what's happening. So how can you be sure that the meat you're eating is from the United States and has been raised with the highest quality standards and is the tastiest? It's truly made here. Well, it's simple. You can go to our friends at Merriweather Farms. Meriwether Farms is an American small business. It's based in Riverton, Wyoming. We know the people who run it, and they're great people. And they have great meat. They ship the highest quality meat, raised free from growth hormones and antibiotics, directly to your doorstep. It's delicious. We eat it a lot, including at this table. These are Americans. These are American-made products. And because they're cutting out the grocery store middlemen, their prices are actually cheaper, 10 to 30% cheaper for the best meat. They are the real deal. Again, we eat that meat at this table from Riverton, Wyoming. They're the best. MeriwetherFarms.com. Use the discount code Tucker10 and you get an extra 10% off. Again, that's Meriwether Farms, MERIWETHER, farms.com. It's worth it.
So that just seems like such an emergency.
And for me, like if I could save one of these kids, it would be worth giving my life for it. I'm 70 years old. To save one kid at birth, it would be worth dying for. And to the opportunity and the need for me to save all of these kids, I would do anything for. I would literally do anything for it.
We were talking at breakfast. I'm sure your perception is different because we're talking about you. But, you know, for 15 years anyway, there was not a single story about you that didn't dismiss you as a dangerous crackpot for questioning why autism is much more common than it once was. Much more. I mean, exponentially more common. And you've written a lot about this and you were attacked. I don't see those attacks very much anymore.
Well, they're still in the mainstream media. That's still part of the, you know, the litany of my crimes. But you know, anybody who uses their head, and that's one of the reasons they won't let me speak on the media. I mean, when Ross Perot ran, he was running for 10 months. He was on mainstream media 34 times interviews. And you remember him. He was on, it seemed like he was on Larry King every week.
Of course.
And I got, in 16 months, I had 2 live interviews on all of those networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, 2. You know, they're just basically mouthpieces now for the DNC. And there was this obligatory litany of defamations and pejoratives that were used to describe me anytime my name was mentioned, you know, that I was not a crackpot. You know, it's like a supervillain. So, and I'm not complaining because that's just, you know, I knew what I was getting into. But anyway, the idea that, you know, I had these meetings with President Trump, and they were partly because of you. You know, you were the one who, Callie Means called me about, I'd say 3 hours after President Trump was shot. Callie Means called, although it doesn't seem possible because, but I think it was only 3 hours after his shooting. And
it was Saturday night.
Yeah, Saturday night. And Callie Means said to me, you know, he told me, Callie had been advising me for a long time and my campaign. He told me that night, I've been advising President Trump, which delighted me because I thought, oh my gosh, there's another candidate beside me that is listening to the truth. And he said that there was interest in the Trump campaign by the president of including me. And then he talked about vice president, which I wasn't interested in. But he said, you know, would you be interested in talking with with President Trump? And I said, I don't think so. And part of this was I just thought it was a non-starter with Cheryl. And I called Cheryl up, and she said to me, you should hear them out. And I immediately called Callie. I texted Callie back and said, I'm interested. And then I got a text from you. And you and I have each other's cell phones. And you had an unknown cell phone number, which you had linked me into, which was President Trump's number. And you said, you know, he's waiting for your call. And so I called him that night. I had a great conversation with him. And then he asked, well, we decided to talk. And I met him the next day. He was at that point at Bedminster, which is his golf course and home in New Jersey. And he'd driven there from Butler, where he had been shot. And then I went to, and so I flew out to Minneapolis the next day. And I had probably a 2-hour meeting with him and Amaryllis, who's my daughter-in-law, who is running my campaign, the smartest person I've ever met, and Cheryl and Susie Wiles. And it was a really interesting meeting because he was so open about first of all, not liking the neocons.
Yeah.
And, I never imagined that because for me, he was the guy who brought John Bolton and Mike Pompeo into office. And, but he was really disillusioned with them, to say the least, And then, he was deeply interested and well-informed, as he is on any, as much as he is on any subject, about what's happening to our kids, chronic disease. And then he was absolutely adamant about stopping the censorship and making sure that we had free speech. And so we talked a little then and didn't really come to any, talked about the possibility of working together. After that, but then we put it on hold. They wanted me to do something at the convention. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And we still, at that point, there was still a chance that I could get into the debate. That chance was diminishing. And because I was not allowed on any media, and because, my only chance of winning the election, I believe I would have won if I had gotten on the debate stage. But my only chance was to get on the debate stage. And that possibility was vanishing. And so I was looking at kind of my options. I then contacted Harris's campaign because I thought I should talk to them and see if they're interested in any of these issues, which I suspected they were not because Kamala was still an empty slate. Kamala, was an empty slate. So,
she's pronounced it both ways herself, so it's okay.
I want to respect people and give them,
yes.
So I reached out to her, and I reached out through a number of people, including some relatives of mine who are very, very close to her personally and to the Democratic Party, and they just said, that's a non-starter. There's no way in the world that she's going to talk to you. And they said, we can get you a meeting with a low-level campaign official. And I said, okay, I'm not interested in that.
Why wouldn't, it's interesting, why wouldn't Kamala Harris meet with you?
Maybe the same reason that she hasn't given an interview. I think it seems to me that there's a lot of handlers involved. And even when you talk to Democrats about, do you really think it's a good idea to be electing somebody who cannot give an interview? They say, well, you're not electing her, you're electing the people around her. You're electing the apparatus. And the apparatus, but the apparatus, I don't have any faith in. It's an apparatus run that are neocons like Anthony Blinken and who are, running us right up into a World War III. And there are people who masterminded the censorship from inside the White House. That's the apparatus that they want to reelect. And to me, that's an apparatus that has these are the people who are censoring me. These are the people who try to throw me out of the party, who canceled the primaries. That's the apparatus. If it was a Democrat who said, I can think on my own, I understand what this country's supposed to look like, I understand what democracy is supposed to look like, then I think that's great. Let's do that.
But it's strange from her perspective. First of all, electing an apparatus is not how democracy works. That's an oligarchy, just in point of fact. But as a political calculation, your presence in the race running third party hurt Trump. No one disputes that. The polling's really clear on that. So if you're the Harris campaign, kind of a win, right, to get some alignment with you, why, or even human curiosity, you'd think would compel her to want to meet with you. Like, take a meeting. Like, why do you care? But she wouldn't even talk to you. I think it's very weird.
It's weird, but not, I mean, I can't stress this, not being able to give an interview. I mean, your whole life is in public life. That's what you do. That is the currency.
Right.
I give, you know, this day is a really slow day because I'm doing one interview with you. But on a typical day, I do about 7 or 8 interviews, some days 10 or 12. And I do that every day, and I've done that for 16 months. If anybody who wants to go, I mean, we have a list now, 4,000 people want to interview me, but I'm interviewing as many people as possible. So I want to get my voice out, my vision out, my concerns out. And it's incomprehensible to me that you would be in public life. And President Trump does the same thing. He's not scared of an interview.
No, he likes it.
And Theo Vaughn.
Yeah.
He's done you. He does anybody. He does people who don't agree with him. He's not censoring you.
No.
He's doing, you know, he's talking to reporters who write crappy articles about him all the time. You know, from New York Magazine.
Maggie Haberman at the New York Times.
Maggie Haberman has never written a nice word about Donald Trump, and he talks to her how often?
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah. So, you know, my Uncle Teddy, who was exactly opposite of Ronald Reagan, ideologically, and he ran against Carter.
Yeah.
Teddy did, and Carter and he had an antipathy toward each other that was almost, you know, like nothing I'd ever seen. Teddy didn't hate people, but he really, I would say, loathed Carter. He had complete disdain for him, and he liked Reagan, and because I was more ideologically aligned at that point. I'd say to him, you know, why do you like Reagan? And he said, because even though I don't agree with anything he said, he was able to invigorate our country. He was able to inspire people. He got people excited about his vision and proud to be Americans. And that is one of the functions of a president. It's to explain to us why we should be proud of each other and why we're part of a community and why our country is great and, you know, what our future is going to look like and get us and you know, inspire all of us with that vision. And that is what a real leader does. How in the world can you do that if you cannot give an interview to a news organ.
To a friendly news organization.
To a friendly news.
Yeah.
They can't even do a setup interview in 40 days. I saw the only interview she did that was unscripted was when she got off a plane. I think it was at Andrews Air Force Base. And so there was a reporter waiting there and that, you know, with one question. When are you going to do an interview? And she said, I've told my team that to try to get one done before September. This was the 3rd of August. And I'm doing, you know, 7 or 8 interviews a day.
Tells you a lot.
And I'm not, you know, blowing my own horn or anything. I'm just saying that's what you do if you're in public life. And what's the point of being in public life if you don't want to promote your vision? If you don't want to inspire people. Yeah.
Well, so I'm sure this is a sensitive subject, but I can't help but notice that you ran for 15 months with no Secret Service protection at all. You were denied that by the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Trump, during the convention in Milwaukee last month, noted that in public. They immediately, under pressure, responded and gave you Secret Service protection.
Yes.
Now they've withdrawn it. You're without it again.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yes.
Meanwhile, Tony Fauci has it. He's not a federal employee anymore. I think Mike Pompeo has Secret Service protection, former CIA director. But you don't. How is that?
I think I'm technically still running for president. I'm running for president in 40 states. So I'm not, I did not terminate my campaign. Did you know this?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. So, I'm running in there's 10 states where I heard President Trump, and they're battleground states. So I've taken my name off the ballot in those 10 states. But in the blue states, all red states, I'm on the ballot. And I could technically win a contingency election if the other two vote, if the other two get 269 apiece. And then Congress cannot work out a compromise, which is entirely possible. They have to go to the third vote getter, which would be me. And that's why I left my name on the ballot in those states. And so, that's highly unlikely to happen, but it has happened twice before in American history. And actually, in our polling now shows them at exactly 269 to 269. So it is possible that it would happen in this campaign. We worked this out with the Trump campaign. They only wanted us off in 10 states because that's the states we heard them. In the other states, people can vote for me, and they're not going to hurt their candidate. They can vote for me even if they like Vice President Harris and without hurting her, and they can vote for me if they like President Trump without hurting him, because we already know what's going to happen in those states.
Yes. So all the more reason that you should have what Tony Fauci has and what Mike Pompeo has, and a lot of other, by the way, non-current federal employees have, which is government bodyguards. But they withdrew them immediately from you. So what's the message of that?
Well, the message, I think, is a bad message, which is that our federal enforcement agencies have been weaponized against the American people. I mean, again, weaponized politically, not against the American people, but politically. When my father took office in the Justice Department, and my father was appointed a U.S. Attorney General in 1961 by my uncle, his brother. And my father, the first week in office, he had run my uncle's campaign, so he was a political guy. He called together all the division chairs, all the branch chiefs in the DOJ, and he made us into his big cavernous office. And he said to them, we're going to make one rule here, which is there is no politics. We never ask whether a potential defendant is Democrat or Republican. The people of this country have to know that their enforcement institutions, the Department of Justice, the justice is blind here. We are free of any kind of political prejudice or bias or favoritism. And they started putting in jail. He prosecuted my uncle on my mother's side for antitrust violation. He prosecuted friends of his father's, whose father did not want him to prosecute. And they just said, it doesn't matter. We've got to apply it even-handedly, because the American people need to understand that their institutions are free. We need to respect them and know that they're not biased in one way. And we're losing that now in our country. And the Biden administration has really accelerated that. The most shocking thing to me, and Democrats can't even hear this story because it touches so many sort of culture war buttons, but it's a true story. People need to understand it and appreciate it. In the 2020 election, when Hunter Biden's laptop a week before and we only know this whole story recently because of a release of documents. But when President Hunter Biden's laptop suddenly became an issue about a week before the debate, and Anthony Blinken, who is now the Secretary of State, and who was then the director of President Biden's campaign, went to Gina Haspel, who is the head of this director of the CIA, and said to her, we need help with this. She then got 51 CIA, current and former CIA officers to sign a public letter, which they published, I think, in the New York Times, but they published it somewhere, that said that Hunter Biden's laptop was a Russian hoax that was part of a Russian disinformation effort to tamper with the presidential election campaign. So you had the CIA, which is forbidden by its charter from involving itself in any American politics. And you had 51 top officers, former and current, who now do a disinformation campaign against the American public to tamper with the election, while accusing the Russians of tampering with the election. And then a week later, President Biden, when he's asked about the laptop on the debate, he says that has been debunked by the CIA, by the CIA officers. And that was the end of the issue, because it was debunked. All the newspapers picked that up. And it's highly likely that that had an impact on the election. So, that was the entree of President Biden getting into office. And again, Democrats who hear me say this story are going to say, oh, he's just saying that because, he's a Republican now, right? Which I'm not, but that's what they're going to say. But it's not that. It's just that this was wrong.
The big tech companies censor our content. I hate to tell you that it's still going on in 2024, but you know what they can't censor? Live events. And that's why we are hitting the road on a fall tour for the entire month of September, coast to coast. We will be in cities across the United States. We'll be in Phoenix with Russell Brand, Anaheim, California with Vivek Ramaswamy, Colorado Springs with Tulsi Gabbard, Salt Lake City with Glenn Beck, Tulsa, Oklahoma with Dan Bongino, Kansas City with Megyn Kelly, Wichita with Charlie Kirk, Milwaukee with Larry Elder, Rosenberg, Texas with Jesse Kelly, Grand Rapids with Kid Rock, Hershey, Pennsylvania with J.D. Vance, Reading, Pennsylvania with Alex Jones, Fort Worth, Texas with Roseanne Barr, Greenville, South Carolina with Marjorie Taylor Greene, Sunrise, Florida with John Rich, Jacksonville, Florida with Donald Trump Jr. You can get tickets at tuckercarlson.com. Hope to see you there.
So the CIA, a lot of roads lead back, unfortunately, to our most powerful intelligence agency. If you were asked, would you run it? Would you become CIA director if you were asked?
I would never get, yes, I would, but I would never get Senate confirmation. As you know, the intelligence agency are protected by very, very powerful committees in the Senate and in the House that are all read into the project. And the people who serve on those committees are people who would, they would not, they're safeguarding that directorship. And I would be very, very dangerous for those committees. So I don't think that.
And yet in his, in your joint appearance on Friday, President Trump introduced you by saying that he plans to, if elected, establish a commission to declassify the remaining documents around your uncle's murder in 1963.
Yeah.
And I think everyone at this point knows the truth, which is the CIA is implicated in that. Those documents protect CIA, maybe among others.
Well, whether they do or not, it's odd that they've not allowed them to be released.
What could possibly be the explanation?
More than 60 years after my uncle's death, almost 65 years. 62 years after his death. And none of the people who were implicated in that crime are alive now.
Yes.
And the last ones have died off in the last year or two. And so it clearly is to protect the institution.
Yes.
And that's wrong. It's just wrong. And it's wrong for a Democrat and it's wrong for Republicans.
It's just interesting, though, that a bipartisan list of presidents, these 6 decades, have kept those files classified.
Well, you and I have both. I was astonished that Trump didn't declassify them because he promised to during the campaign.
That was Mike Pompeo who did that.
Yeah, and that I talked to President Trump for the first time about that this week. And
what did he say?
He said that Mike Pompeo begged him to, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here.
No,
I think he told the same thing to you.
That's
right?
true.
But he said Mike Pompeo called him and said this would be a catastrophe to release these. You need to not do it. And then,
I want to say again, I think Mike Pompeo is a criminal. So that's my view. He's threatened to sue me for saying that, but I hope he will, because that's true. But that kind of tells the whole story right there, right? That the CIA is.
Well, yeah. So that's the
why would the CIA be trying to keep these files classified if they had nothing to do with the murder? I don't really get that.
Yeah, but the subject we were talking about was the weaponization of the federal agency, and that's just one of them. And then they get, then they open up these censorship portals 37 hours after President Biden takes office, where now you have the FBI involved in American politics, and, which we ran them out in the 60s, because we were outraged that they were bugging Martin Luther King and the Black Panther Party, and Americans were indignant about that. Why do they think this? I mean, have we gotten to the point where it's so normalized and now we're okay with the FBI running a portal to censor political speech in our country and then inviting in the CIA and CISA and the IRS? I don't know what they were doing in there.
Nothing good.
NIH and, CDC and all these other agencies, DHS, which all had a hand in censoring American speech. So that was another thing. And then the use, which we saw for the first time in American history of the judiciary to get rid of candidates. What they tried to do to me, they're suing me now in a dozen states. I've been in trials for the past 3 weeks. I've spent most of my time not campaigning. But sitting in court in cases that are trying to get me off the ballot. So, I had 1 million people, 1 million American citizens sign petitions, more than any candidate in history. Everybody said I'd never do this, impossible to be in the ballot in 50 states. Well, guess what? We got on the ballot in 50 states. And we did it by getting 1 million citizens to sign petitions saying that they wanted to vote for me. And the Democratic Party now is suing me in all those states to make sure that those people cannot vote for the person they want to. When I was growing up, the Democratic Party of RFK and JFK was the party that was fighting for voting rights. It was fighting to make sure that every American could vote for the candidate of their choice, no matter whether they're black or white or where they lived or Democrat or Republican. Now the Democratic Party, today's Democratic Party, feels so unconfident about the candidates that it's putting forward. And it feels the only way it can win the election is by getting rid of the opponents. And either using the courts against President Trump to lock him in jail and to embarrass and humiliate and discredit him, or using the courts against me to just to throw me off the ballot, even though the voters, in New York State, I had to get 45,000 ballot signatures in 13 congressional districts. I got 137,000 in all 26 congressional districts. I did twice when anybody wanted, and we did it easily because people wanted to see me on the ballot. New Yorkers wanted to see me on the ballot. Why is the Democratic Party suing me in frivolous cases?
On what grounds?
I spent a whole week in a trial for that case. For 2 cases they brought, and another week in another trial for another case.
And you had to pay for this?
It's costing me $10 million to defend myself.
But on what grounds are they suing you? Like they don't like you, so you don't have a right to be on the ballot, or what?
In New York State, they're suing me by they can't challenge our signatures because we got 5 times as many signatures as we were required. So that, normally what they were doing in the first states, they're taking our signatures and they were calling everybody. They can get their numbers and they can get their cell phones, etc. We're contacting everybody who's signated and trying to talk them out of it, trying to get them to say, you're hurting democracy, and you should, weren't you fooled when you did this, to try to get it. They never succeeded. They're in New York State. They're suing me because they say that I don't live in New York State. So I have 3 residences. One is in New York, One is in my home in Massachusetts, which, is part of my family compound that we've owned for, 100 years. And then in California, where I live with Cheryl. So I moved with Cheryl to California in 2014, so 10 years ago. But I lived in New York all my life. I lived there since I was 10. My father ran for Senate there and was the senator. I moved there when I was 10. I've only voted in New York. I've always considered myself a New York resident. I've lived in the same town for 40 years in Bedford. I've lived in 13 different residences in that town at various times. But I always wanted to stay there. And when I moved out west with Cheryl, I made an agreement with her that, when she retires, we're going to come back to New York because I feel like I'm a New Yorker. I didn't want to vote in California because I don't know anything about the politics out there. I was raised in New York. I know all the politics, all the politicians. And so I wanted to vote. So I kept an address there. I voted that address. That's my only place I've ever voted. My car is registered there. My driver's license is there. My law office is there. I pay income tax, almost all my income taxes from New York State. My law license is there. I don't have a law license in California. And my hunting license is there. My fishing license
Most
is there.
importantly.
My falconry license is there. So I have all my birds there. I keep them there. And so, but they're suing me saying I'm not a real New Yorker. I contrived the address out of fraud and it's a sham. And here's the thing, is that I consulted a lawyer when we declared independent and began getting ballot signatures. I consulted the best ballot access attorney in the country, Paul Rossi. And I said, I got these 3 different residences. Which one do I put on the ballot? You have to put the same residence in all 50 states. So you can't choose another resident. I can't put California in one state and Massachusetts in another state, in New York. I have to tell the people, otherwise I'm lying to somebody, right?
Right.
So in a couple of states, for example, Maine, where we are right now, and in New Hampshire, those states say the only place you can put down as your domicile is the place where you vote. And in New Hampshire, I actually had to take an oath in front of a notary that I voted in New York, because otherwise they couldn't have put it down. So I had to put New York in every state because I had to put it in Maine and New Hampshire and a bunch of others because you have to put the place you vote. Anyway, the DNC is suing me, saying I defrauded the public because I really live in California, and they got a judge who was right out of the Democratic machine, and who violated the Constitution and every precedent to say, yeah, they're right. So, I lost in the lower court, which is what happens. We're doing that. We're losing in these lower courts, and then we win in the appeals. There's a 100% chance I'll win in the appeal, but they don't care because it's going to take me a while, and they got the headline saying he was thrown off for fraud.
So I saw Kamala Harris just the other night at her convention speech talk about how voting access is like a...
I know. While she was doing that, I was in court in New York, trying to get on that ballot
the John Lewis Voting Access Act, we're going to get through. Yeah. Everybody has a right to vote.
Yeah, it's not.
Except for their opponents. So it feels to me like this is, obviously it's a big political story. You're endorsing Trump. It's a big change in your life as a lifelong Democrat, still a Democrat. But it also feels like, as you said at the outset.
Well, I'm an independent now, so I registered as an independent when I ran. And when I talk with President Trump, the thing that we talked about is that, that we were going to do a unity government with the independent, not the kind of endorsement that a lot of people make, but an endorsement like Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals, where we would be able to continue to differ publicly on issues, but that we would, on the issues that we agree on, that we were going to strive to get into government together in order to make sure that those issues are the priority for our country. And, he was really good about that and about, me being able to continue on. There's some issues. There's a lot of issues like the border where we agree and, censorship, the wars, the neocons, the, forever wars, child health epidemics. Those are the most important issues. There's other issues that that I'm going to disagree on with President Trump, but he was happy with that. And that's how our country ought to be. We ought to be able to.
So what is this realignment that you mentioned at the outset? Because this does feel like it's bigger than just this November.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a series of these realignments throughout American history. And, there's history books that are written about, the realignments. I think there's about 5 of them. And one of those is clearly happening now because you see on so many issues, you've had an inversion. The Democratic Party has become the party of the elites. It used to be the party of the poor and the working class. In fact, there was a study that came out just recently that I saw that showed that 70%, that the people who voted for Biden own 70% of the wealth in this country. The people who voted for Trump own 30%. And so
I believe that.
Right. So you're seeing this realignment happen where the elites, where Wall Street, where the big tech, big pharma, the big banking houses are all now Democratic. And that the working class, the middle class, the cops, the firefighters, Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters Union, spoke.
Great guy.
A great guy, great guy. Really love him. But he spoke at the Democratic convention. The Republican convention rather than Democratic convention. So you're seeing this big alignment, and even on environmental issues. It's so weird to me because the Democrats have become subsumed in this carbon orthodoxy. And you and I have talked about this, that the only issue is carbon. And what that's done is it's forced them to do something that you should never do if you're an environmentalist, which is to commoditize and quantify everything. So everything is measured by its carbon footprint, how many tons of carbon it produces. And, you're basically, you're putting everything in that kind of box of being able to quantify it and explain its value by numerically. And the reason that we protect the environment is just the opposite of that. The reason that we protect the environment is because there's a spiritual connection. There's there's a love that we have. I got into the environment because I wanted, this connection to the fishes and the birds and the wildlife and the whales. And the Purple Mountain's majesty, and that, I understood that the way, God talks to human beings through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great prophets, through the wise people, the great books of those religions, but nowhere with the kind of detail and texture and grace and joy as through creation. And when we destroy nature, we diminish our capacity to sense the divine, to understand who God is and what our own potential is and duties are as human beings. And that...
I hope what you just said, by the way, is chopped up and put all over every social media platform in the world. When we destroy nature, we degrade our own ability to experience the divine.
Yeah. And that it's not about quantifying stuff. That's what the devil does. He quantifies everything, right? And that is, what he wants us doing. Put a number on it. And the reason we're preserving these things is because we love our children, and it's because we get nature enriches us economically and spiritually and culturally and historically. It connects us to those 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before there were laptops. And it connects us to the most important spiritual lesson. All of the organized religions that we know of today, the central revelation of every one of those religions always occurred in the wilderness. Moses had to go into the wilderness to listen to hear God's voice and see the burning bush. He had to go to the wilderness of Mount Sinai to get the commandments. Muhammad who was a city boy from Mecca, had to go to the wilderness of Mount Hera on a camping trip with his kids and wrestle the angel Gabriel in the middle of the night and have the first stanzas of the surahs of the Quran squeezed from him. Buddha had to go into the wilderness to sit under and wander for years, and then sit under the Bodhigaya tree to get his first revelation of nirvana. And Christ had to spend 40 days in the wilderness to discover his divinity for the first time. And his mentor was John the Baptist, who lived in a cave in the Jordan Valley and ate honey of wild bees and locusts. And then all of Christ's parables come from nature. I am the vine, you are the branches, the mustard seed, the little swallows, the scattering the seeds on the fallow ground. Because that is where we sense the divine. God talks to us through the fishes, the birds, the leaves. They're all, words from our Creator. And that is why we preserve nature.
Yes.
It's not because of it's not because the quantity of carbon. And by the way,
I feel what you said so deeply, I can hardly even express it. And thank you for saying that.
And by the way, the best thing that you can do for climate is to restore the soils. The soils are the solution to everything. The soil will absorb all that carbon. And it'll absorb the water. It'll stop the flooding. It'll give us healthy food. And that's what our national policy has to be. It has to be restoring the soil. And that is, everybody, listen, if you want to unite America, then talk about these things. Talk about the fishes, the bird, the wildlife, and just talk about ending mountaintop removal mining. Talk about ending the mountain cutting. Talk about getting rid of, the Democrats are putting these offshore wind farms that are exterminating the whales.
I know.
Most of us got into this because of the whales. And they're about to extinguish the right whales, the last ones on Earth, because with these monstrosities that are costing us 3 times the amount. We don't need them. They cost 33 cents a kilowatt hour when you can get onshore wind for 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And who's making the money? Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, foreign governments. And the other thing that they're funding, hundreds of billions of dollars. This is what climate has turned into, is these climate capture pipelines that are wreaking havoc with the agricultural lands across the Midwest, stealing people's property rights with, eminent domain. And who's making the money? BlackRock. And it's a useless technology that does not work. It's just all a boondoggle. And that's what's become the environmental movement in this country. And if you depart from that orthodoxy, you're expelled from it. If you want to make Americans fight each other, talk about carbon. If you want to bring Americans together, talk about habitat protection.
Yeah, nature.
It's
a little weird. You literally spent your life with river keepers as an environmentalist, an environmental lawyer in the environmental movement. That's your life work product. Have you been expelled from the movement?
Pretty much, yeah. The weird thing is I think of you as a radical environmentalist.
Well, I definitely am.
Yeah. You are.
I haven't showered inside in 10 years. Yeah. No, I feel it so strongly.
But also, you love nature. You're against these big projects that are destroying it. And, you talk about toxics. And the environmental movement no longer talks about toxics anymore. They don't care about it. They don't care that we're mass poisoning our children. It's so weird to me. And I saw you. For 40 years, I've been fighting to get against endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are a class of chemicals that change. They alter us hormonally, and they change They can change sexual conduct. They can change sexual development. They can affect fertility, and we've already lost 50% of our sperm count. We're having girls in this country that are achieving puberty on average between 10 and 13 years old. That's 6 years less younger than they were, 80 years ago. We have the lowest puberty levels on any continent in the world here because we're just bombarding our children with endocrine disruptors. And they're chemicals like PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, atrazine, which can turn male frogs into females and produce fertile eggs. That's how potent they are as an endocrine disruptor. And it's in 63% of our water supply. PCBs, which I've been fighting since the day I became an environmental lawyer and getting them out of the Hudson. So, and for 40 years, I've been trying to get Republicans to talk about it. I talk Roger Ailes all the time, who both of us know, who would let me occasionally onto Fox News to talk about it. But there was so much hostility from the Republican Party because it was like, you're attacking corporate profit taking, and that these are chemicals, they're molecules, who cares? They can't hurt you. And there was just, and then you do this incredible show on endocrine disruptors. And I'm like, oh my God, Tucker Carlson has just done the best show that's ever been done, showing, what's happening with endocrine disruptors and how they're just destroying us. And the Democrats went after you and the environmental movement. And I'm like, what? This is what we've been trying to get for 40 years, the Republicans to care about these issues. And they said, oh, he's saying that chemicals turn people gay and he's anti-gay and all of this stuff. And that wasn't what you said at all. And that's not what anybody said. And what we're saying is we're destroying our children. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, in God's creation, which is not ours to destroy. Your description of why we protect nature and its role in our lives and what happens when you're cut off from nature and animals, but being part of nature, is the best I've ever heard, ever. And
thank you.
I mean it. And when that, when it becomes a matter of quantifying things for profit, then that kind of corrupts the whole enterprise. So my last question, what happens now? You had this kind of amazing announcement with Donald Trump on Friday. It's now Monday, I think, which is 3 days ago. How do you spend from here until Election Day?
I'm going to work to get him elected, and I'm working with the campaign. We're working on policy issues together. I've been asked to go onto the transition team, and to help pick the people who will be running the government, and I'm looking forward to that. And I'm going to fight. I don't know what would happen to me if we lose.
Well, that's kind of it. I mean, a lot of people I know personally and I'm friends with have gone to prison. One of them is in prison right now, Pavel Durov. There are others. What happens if he loses to you?
If
Trump loses and Kamala Harris becomes president?
Oh, I don't know. But I mean, I never really think about that. What I think is
good.
What I think is, okay, here's what I got to do today, and get up every day and say, reporting for duty, sir, and then go do that, and nothing's a crisis, everything's a task, right? And so that's what I'm going to be, kind of a happy warrior. I know what I have to do, so I'm going to do it.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you.
That
was really that was a blessing. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So it turns out that YouTube is suppressing our show. I know. Shocking that in an election year, with everything at stake, Google would be putting its thumb on the scale and preventing you from hearing anything that the people in charge don't want you to hear. But it turns out it's happening. So what can you do about it? Well, we could whine about it, but that's a waste of time. We're not in charge of Google. Or we could find a way around it, a way that you could actually get information that's true. It's not intentionally deceptive. And the way to do that on YouTube, we think, is to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe, and you'll have a much higher chance of hearing what we say, and we hope you will.